Hey everyone, welcome back to the Rap Media Group Chronicles, the podcast where we talk with agency founders and creative leaders who are reshaping how businesses grow. We dive into the real stories behind successful agencies, the wins, the lessons, and everything in between, so you can build smarter and grow faster. Today's guest is Scott Starrett, founder and creative director of Tandem NYC, widely known for reshaping the modern visual language of political branding. His work has influenced movement, cultural institutions, and advocacy organizations across the country. Scott, it is great to have you on the show.
It's a pleasure to be here. Excited for the conversation.
So am I. So, for any listeners who don't know what you do, would you mind to explain your day to day at Tandem NYC, please?
Yeah, absolutely. I think for those folks that come from the agency world, to put it in terms outside of our niche, more broadly, we are a full service design consultancy, a brand strategy firm. And sometimes we get into the world of just strategic consulting generally, but we tend to describe what we do as communication design. We live within a specific niche, though. You touched on that, and that is the world of advocacy, nonprofits, foundations, cause-based work.
And what would you say has been the most challenging part of working in advocacy and political design today?
Yeah, I mean, there are two parts that I would say are extremely challenging. One is getting your foot in the door, which takes a different path. I get a lot of young folks when I give talks around the country that say, "How do I begin doing the work that you're doing?" And in the design world, we shouldn't tell folks to do spec work or to do things that are good for their portfolio for free. That is kind of an abuse of labor. But in this world, it's really easy to be an interloper. When you show up and say, "Oh, I'd love to make you a new logo," your nonprofit should be so grateful. It's not quite how it tends to go. Folks are pretty protective and skeptical of outsiders. So, the only way in is to be a part of the group, and you do so by volunteering your time. You show up not to tell them how to run their communications, but to be a part of whatever effort it is. And that is how you build legitimacy in this world. The other side of things is that, in building that trust and then the trust that you carry into other jobs as people hear that you are seasoned, as activist or an advocate alongside them, is that you're on someone's team, and often people are up against tight deadlines or pressures from outside forces. And so it's really easy to find yourself in every situation as an all hands on deck, rapid response, everything's on fire situation, which as agency owners know is a tough time to account for costs, and a lot of extra hours go into, pulling the studio in different directions to address emergencies. And it's nearly impossible to avoid in this world. Work shows up at wild times, when people are engaging in events that are, in the news, and they get calls from reporters or flooded, with accusations of something that maybe they had no role in, but somebody said something on Twitter and they're calling to follow up to see, and then a press release has to go out. Those are the times it's really tough to say, we can't be a part of your team in this enormous effort. We've got other things going on. And so it's really easy to spread yourself thin. Being a trusted advocate alongside standing shoulder to shoulder, or, not playing by traditional, rules and roles of a more transactive relationship.
Yeah, I'll be honest with you, Scott. I haven't interviewed anyone who's been in this niche before, and from what I'm hearing, it's very complex. And do you get a lot of sort of opposing parties that you can't really promote because you're promoting this group?
Yeah, conflicts of interest.
Yeah, I was going to say that, but I wasn't sure if that's the right word to describe it.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think I appreciate your caution, because I think, that's a whole nother conversation. The language we tend to use in this world is, it does differ from, the traditional marketing language. We either have adopted their language, or sometimes we adjust things, like instead of stakeholder interviews, we call them facilitated listening sessions. So I think it's appropriate, but I think we'll try to put things in terms that your audience is probably more familiar with.
Yeah,
I
I
certainly
do as
I
well.
came up in the traditional marketing space. I can usually convert the terminology. But yeah, I think that is a complex part of it. There's a lot of saying no to things, not only because, you might be in a situation where there are kind of opposing interests and not drastically opposing because it's not like I'm gonna, people on the far right are not gonna be calling me to support their causes. That just doesn't happen. But there are times when we're working on a political race, for example, and we have to say no to one candidate over the other, or we have to be cautious about who might enter the race. And I think the same goes for working with C3s or C4s. There are times that people are at odds in some form or another. And then there's the other consideration, which is, the work we take on as a studio shapes our reputation, for lack of a better term. And that reputation means a lot to people that are vetting agencies and partners by their values. So it's pretty easy to make a decision that bends you in slightly the wrong direction because the org, they may be aligned on a lot of things, but maybe they don't share the same perspective as a lot of my colleagues and partners that are working on a slightly different project. So that was the long way to say yes.
Hmm. On our previous chat, you mentioned a little bit about your background because it's not really a niche you just get into because you need to have so much more experience, which you touch point you do have. Would you mind to explain that for the audience as well, just so they understand?
Yeah, I say I came from a traditional marketing background, and that's true to an extent. I worked at a nonprofit out of school. I went to school for design and illustration, and started as just an entry level graphic designer, but slowly worked my way into the marketing roles in that nonprofit, and ultimately ended up in a pretty high leadership role at a pretty young age. And so I was working with big budgets and I was working with e-commerce at a higher level and a lot of the digital marketing considerations that come from operating and being responsible for a pretty successful operation when it comes to e-commerce and in-store sales and just services broadly. I learned a lot of the digital marketing techniques necessary, and then ultimately found myself being curious about the world of politics, which was always kind of a distracting interest of mine, for lack of a better term. And I, wondered what it might be like to blend those interests, this design world and marketing world that I was occupying. And I sought to join a firm from the perspective of designer, but kind of ended up learning a lot about the world of political strategy in the process. I became a designer and a strategist and learned how to do a lot of development work in the world of politics. And that's really where I confronted that education. But I think it even started much sooner, with my interests, with how I spent my spare time. And I think that's something for agency owners everywhere to think about. Sometimes those things can feel very separate, and it's certainly a choice you have to make. Do you want to work, you know, in your day-to-day interests all the time? I think that there are pros and cons to that, but it can also, it can be really motivating to continue to learn about the things you care about. And I think, I think even if uh, you find yourself in an explicitly commercial world, I think there are ways to aim yourself at, towards your interests and towards novel concepts you want to learn about. But again, like I said, pros and cons, because to be steeped in something, 24 hours a day, I think takes its own toll, certainly.
I agree with you there, but it's like you say, you sort of serving your passion, politics, which is great. But at the same time, do you have to tread carefully around your own political opinions and what you pretty much put yourself and position yourself as out there on social media and everything else? Because it is, like you say, a very sort of complicated. So what is your sort of process there? Are you kind of more laid back?
Well, if anyone's gone to my social media, and our social media Tandem, they'll be gravely disappointed because I have over the years become allergic to social media, and I think that it has to do with those early days that I was talking about in the marketing world. there was so much focus on social media. I'm fairly old. I'm 41, about to be 42 here in.
Wow, you don't look like it.
Well, thank you. That's very kind of you. You could see some gray over here
Oh,
coming
you're
in.
hiding that side. Yeah, I
Yeah.
see.
Oh, yeah. That's I didn't realize how strategic my angle was here. And so I came up as Facebook was kind of coming to fruition. Back when people were wondering, do you need to really engage in Google circles, which may go right over some of the audience's head. But it was Google's attempt at a social network there for a little bit. Um, as all these things emerged, I kind of had a desire not to have to keep up with the Joneses on one hand. And then on the other side, to the point of your question, which is a fantastic one, what are the risks and the rewards of posting on social media? I made a very conscientious choice to take our studio out of the world of personal political promotion. It's something that we considered in the beginning. And as a studio, we're very democratic. I don't want the studio to be my personal politics. And at the same time, I also want to keep ourselves open to a spectrum of folks. We certainly have a sort of conditional intake process, and we vet people to be assured that they are, that we're aligned in our values. But, what I didn't want to do is exclude our opportunity to work with somebody in the educational sector, or, people that are working to bring programs like a policing alternative to a municipality. The city may not take too kindly to them partnering with someone that has certain views on record. And so it's, I know that some people can see that as, opportunistically shielding our politics, but I think the people that we take on speak for themselves. And it's kind of like when you're an agency or a design studio and you make your site all white and you reduce your branding so that it doesn't compete with the folks that you're communicating on behalf of. And I think that was the perspective that I was eager to take. I think we are still fully supportive of those that are politically aligned with us. We don't back down from people that are making big statements, but we feel more comfortable speaking through our clients, or working with our clients, partnering and collaborating with our clients to help their messages get out with clarity. So we are really minimal when it comes to social media, and I've really let it drop off lately because ultimately we have enough incoming to be designing our future as is.
Mhm.
So the idea that we need to bring more people into the funnel for our studio right now is just not quite something that I have found myself thinking is worth the cost benefit.
So, how do clients find you nowadays? What sort of source has worked you the best? I'm guessing it's mostly referrals.
It is a lot of referrals. We have a pretty healthy network. As I mentioned, having shown up for people, being a part of certain causes, sometimes it takes years, but you're planting seeds when you're doing that as well. Again, I want to be cautious about telling people to just go donate all their time, because there's a risk in that. It doesn't always come back, and it's also not easy to maintain just a cause-based agency. There's a lot of compromise involved, and I think there's a lot of extra work, and it's not something I think everyone necessarily can, even with their heart in the right place, necessarily sustain themselves and others doing. I think the elephant in the room here is not only that we've built up this strong network, and that long-term collaborations turn into more long-term collaborations, or, donating your time to someone because you like what they're working on means that they become an advocate for you and they go and try to find you work, or they go on to do big things. And then they invite you back into the fold. Certainly that's part of it. I also, as I mentioned, I go around and I do talks fairly frequently, and I've met a lot of wonderful people that I've collaborated with doing things like that. But ultimately, like I said, that elephant in the room is a certain notability, or a certain amount of press coverage and focus that was put on our studio at a certain point. Pretty much has everything to do with the opportunities that we have now. And so, one of the ways that folks might find us, if they aren't hearing about us through network or meeting us in person, sometimes they see us on social media, but it's a series of articles and videos and coverage of our work during the 2018 congressional race of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who became known to the world as AOC. She was a friend of ours, friend of the studio, and we helped with her campaign that was a political upset and garnered a lot of press attention the world over. Sometimes we'll get invited to participate in presidential races in other countries or Senate races or the equivalent of in other countries. And that work generally comes through
Hiding.
this profile that was built online through kind of more traditional media, digital articles, but Washington Post and New York Times and Vox and Fast Company and outlets like that.
I mean, talking about that pipeline again, because this is a sort of a combination between marketing agency owners. You seem like you got the hang of it, something that works, and then a year later on it doesn't, because let's say, for example, email marketing for others out there that are doing it, suddenly it's too saturated, so it doesn't work anymore. So you constantly need to reinvent on how you're going to focus on your pipeline. Now, is there anything on your pipeline that you tried before, but it doesn't land the same anymore, or something that you had to pivot away from?
Yeah, we tend to not involve ourselves in politics to the same degree that we used to. Like I said, I worked at a political consulting firm, a strategic comms firm, and have a lot of familiarity with the kind of a traditional campaign model. And I certainly can help people launch campaigns and build them on the fly. And it's something that we've done quite a bit of, but something where over time, we realized that we kind of created a heuristic and a sort of approach to political design that a lot of people are engaging with, and not always in a one-to-one. Sometimes it is let's call it an homage to the work that we did that stood out, but I think more so it's a consideration of how far you can stretch someone's political identity. Now, for a while, we were just continuing to take those jobs on when they felt appropriate and values aligned. But when I mentioned before that an organization will pull you into rapid response and everything's on fire, that's about half as problematic as what happens with a politician. But they have essentially created a startup in generally a 9-month, maybe they've given themselves a year proper runway before they need to be fully functioning. That means website, identity, comms strategy, which involves digital marketing and all the practices, not to mention in-person people handing out walk cards and knocking doors. All that coordination happens extremely quickly. And then it's all, it feels like a zero-sum game to those politicians. And they have a deadline, and they either succeed at that deadline or they fail. And so it's really easy for them to become the center of the universe. And I'm sure any agency owner knows a client that makes themselves the center of the universe and can't see outside the problems they face in the short term. And it is intense. And so managing multiple campaigns at any given time is not only problematic, but we kind of felt like we'd done a lot of what we came to do in that world. Now we can be a little more strategic about how we provide our services and our sort of strategic mindset. And we see a lot of long-term benefit in large-scale organizations, nonprofits, foundations, et cetera.
So you're sort of being more strategic about who you onboard on as a client.
Yeah, and really kind of turning ourselves away from day-to-day political campaigns. Yeah, it just, it's not even that it's not just profit driven. It's, as any agency owner knows, sometimes, yeah, you broke even or you made profit on an endeavor, but sometimes there's an emotional toll. There's just the energy that it took to get it over the line. There's, some clients become harrowing in how they communicate with you or how they don't communicate with you. And I think that that's something to keep an eye on for me as a studio owner is, what do certain projects do to the team? And especially if, at the end of the day, you're obviously going to lose a handful of the races that you're participating in. That's a whole other risk. So everybody throws everything they've got at something, and then there's a loss at the end of it. That's not the case when you're working with a nonprofit. I mean, it's possible. It has happened. Some of them tank, some of them fail, some of them run into big problems, but you're really gambling a little bit more in the world of politics. And I think that it's not just politics. I think people probably see that with other clients. Startups can be that way, with people offering sweat equity to agency owners, doing contingency fees. Hey, if we hit this milestone, you'll recoup this much money. I think we all do things in times of desperation when we see that the economy's not great, or we've just hired someone and the overhead is you're just keeping an eye on solvency. Sometimes you have to take those risks. But yeah, I think we are privileged to be sitting in a place where we can point folks in the right direction. We still try to get them connected with the right people. I think that's important part of it. We certainly are not trying to ignore anybody along the way. And I think that goes a long way too. Even a polite nudge towards another designer or an introduction towards another agency. I think that keeps you in people's good graces. And I don't think it always amounts to a ton, but part of being an agency owner is managing that reputation. I think it always can amount to something. People can still speak highly of you, even if you've regretfully turned their work down.
It's a widespread issue. In the beginning, when you're running your agency, you accept anyone who is interested, pretty much. But you become more selective as you go along. And I think that's a learning curve everyone sort of needs to go through. Is it pretty much the same subject about niching now? I mean, there's many marketing agencies saying that's really the only way to stand out right now if you niche down. There's different perspectives about that out there, of course. I mean, you're sort of niche down, but you do serve those other industries as well, which you've seen results in. So, whatever works for each agency owner. But that seems to be the dilemma to niche down. So what is your personal perspective about that?
Well, there are two niches I think we're talking about. Again, it's a really interesting question. The two niches are not only the category that you serve, it's just the case that doing packaging design work tends to beget more packaging design work. Someone sees, a rosé can you made or a boxed wine or something that's really interesting and fun. And so you get another job similar to that. Maybe it's another alcoholic beverage, or maybe it's a sparkling water or something, but it's somebody that's kind of seen that you can do what they need you to do. And so that's going to drive you into a niche.
Mhm.
And then there's your skill set. And so are you a motion graphics firm? Are you a digital marketing firm? Are you doing layout? Or are you offering some of this consulting or this brand strategy that's at a little higher level? And then if you do the brand strategy, do you also build websites? So what we've done is take on a generalist full service model where we provide a lot of services, a kind of an excessive amount, frankly. And then we serve this niche where we can become well known as providing very consistent services to folks that are frontline organizers or running people centric nonprofits that are providing services in some form or another, a settlement house or an educational program or a policing alternatives community, service. And so, then you have a certain kind of experience with a certain kind of subject matter that they know you're sensitive to, that they know you have interest and experience and for lack of, a better word, solidarity with them in their effort. And that is, I think that there's some truth to it, that it really benefits you to be a specialist of some kind. This is something I thought about a lot after I graduated because, like I mentioned, I had an illustration and a graphic design degree, and I was a little bit torn at times. And how do you make both of those work together? And when you're right out of school, people that have bared down on creating their own illustration style and really just pouring all their time into that focus, it really looks like they're taken off, right out of school. People start to see it. That's going to be good for a lot of people's product. They're going to want that kind of illustration. And you might, make a name for yourself, and it could go in perpetuity. But you can also find that you are in a fad. You're part of a style, part of a moment. I mean, I think it's really important to be nimble. I think that my curiosity is probably what drove me into all these other skills and services. And then also just being in this world where you're working with nonprofits that don't have the same financial resources, uh, you know, they don't have somebody that's maybe devoted to social media. They may have a comms director and that person might be doing it all, or they might have an executive director that's writing their newsletter every week. And so you start to provide services for these people that um bright and devoted to what they do, but they probably have a low fluency when it comes to a suite of marketing services. And then you end up filling in out of kind of necessity because they know you and they trust you and they don't know how to find a good copywriter that like works in this world and understands these subjects. And so there we are writing copy for somebody. That is something that we tend to try not to overburden ourselves with. We try to not take on a lot of solo copywriting, but when you bring somebody in for a suite of design services, sometimes they're in need, and part of making a client happy is just doing it, just
Yeah.
taking it on and figuring it out.
There is that other end of the spectrum where you become a yes man, and then, like you said, you overburden yourself and your team. So it's a dangerous game to be playing because you want to deliver the best result for your client. You want to support them along their journey. But then, where does that lead you and your team and their momentum, their mental health as well?
Yeah, their mental health, and then I mean, like, I'd be lying if I didn't say that I don't still see late nights. I mean, I think that's part of it too. At the end of the day, as an owner, you've got to let people go home and get rest and recover. And sometimes that means you're left holding the bag and getting the thing
Yeah.
over the finish line. And I think it takes a certain kind of to be
Yes, I agree. I agree
to
with
be
you
in
there.
this position. And I think it takes you kind of have to lie to yourself. I think every time I'm up and it's, you know, 2 o'clock in the morning and I'm putting the finishing touches on a presentation, I'm like, well, this is the last time. This is the last time I'll
Yeah,
do this.
it
You
never
know,
is it?
No, 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 you have to forget. I guess it's like, however biology blessed us with forgetting the trauma of birth, obviously for women, but it is a harrowing experience all around for anyone that's gone through it. So, to then forget about what a wild ride it is and then
Oh,
get right
yeah, and
back
then do it
into
all
it.
over again.
Yeah, yeah. I'm, of course, thinking about this because I have my second daughter on the way here in not too
Wow,
long.
congratulations.
Thank you. Yeah.
Wow, awesome. So talking a little bit about agency growth and what would you say is working really well for your agency? Or you call it a studio actually.
Yeah, I do. I do. I think that's maybe a New York habit.
Aha.
Sometimes we call ourselves an agency, especially if someone wants to see us in that light. I don't know what to call us, frankly. Kind of perform an odd service. The folks that are similar to us aren't quite the same. There's a lot of overlap with a lot of groups. Some of them are extremely web focused, some of them are extremely brand focused. Some of them are digital that bleed into the brand and the web. And I think we play more of a consultancy role than most. And maybe agency would be the better word, but I think we don't use agency in part too because of the clients we serve. I think agency feels like a more commercial terminology. It feels bigger, and maybe less personal. So I think a studio is perhaps an invitation to collaborate in a slightly different way, less guns for hire and more a team of people that are great problem solvers sitting in a room together.
You know what? I love that positioning because I mean, it's also the fact there's agencies is such an overused word as well. It's like there's one person working for the company, they call themselves an agency.
Yeah.
Well, I love your positioning about a studio.
Yeah, I mean, it's something I think about. I think about all these things. How do you explain it? We're constantly doing this work with other people. One of the questions we ask everybody that we get a chance to interview um, is how would you explain the work you do to a friend's mother? And that it just instantly, sets people in. It's like, if you say elevator pitch, they're trying to sell to somebody. They're trying to they've only got a few seconds to get the job. But when you put it into that perspective, suddenly you're just this person only needs to connect with the idea of your central concept, the why. They don't need to be sold on what you'll do for them. The friend's mother is very unlikely to be a future client. And so when I think about that, and I run experiments, of course, when I meet people and they ask what I do. I think agency actually lands for most people first, and a lot better. I don't think people know what to make of a studio. And frankly, we struggle with our own advice because I think we have a hard time necessarily explaining what we do. And then there's also, anyone in our studio would say, well, tell me more about my friend's mother. What is it? What position that, what perspective does it look like she has on the world? What are her political beliefs? How
Mm,
much am I going to tell this person? And I think that's something we do in real time as well,
mhm.
is vet the interest in the political world and also vet what might be a hot button issue to bring up with somebody.
Is that treading carefully again that we're bringing up in a way?
Yeah. Yeah, yeah. And it tries to be treading carefully or walking a fine line and not walking on eggshells because we're certainly not embarrassed of anything we do. But I think, before you want to jump into a deep ideological conversation, you want to wade into, um, why you do what you do and what you do and, what you create. And then I think it's a much deeper conversation as to what do those creations serve in the world.
So moving really back to that agency growth, what would you say is really working well for the agency right now? What are you sort of happy, let's say this year? Did you achieve the goals you had for the business?
Yeah, we exceeded our goals. It's honestly been one of our best years. And that is kind of a double edged sword because I think when politics, I think when people are a certain kind of dissatisfied and scared, we are more prone to get business. And so it's kind of a sad pattern to have noticed, but I think people come to us in times of distress. For them anyway, obviously everyone isn't distressed, but something that we're both excited and proud of. And like I said, there's a lot of seed planting that goes into being an agency owner, as folks know. Sometimes you have a conversation and it doesn't come to fruition for a year and a half. Somebody says, "Hey, we really need you," and you start to gear up a thing, and then you don't hear from them. And you go, "That was weird." They said that they needed the website by the end of the year, and we didn't hear from them at all. They disappeared, and then they just pop back up. So there's a lot of that, and that accumulates over time. Yeah, we've just had a really good year otherwise, and I think it's tricky because when the economy starts to show signs of distress,
Which it is right now?
take that seriously. And so I think staffing is always a challenge. You're overworked, you don't want to burn the team out, but hiring a whole nother person, that's your overhead. That's another job you have to take on each month. So it's just a really fine line. Right now we're trying to focus on efficiencies, but we have some kind of anomalous jobs coming through that don't have guaranteed where it's guaranteed we're the agency of record, but we don't have like a set pipeline of we can't know when these next things are going to drop. And so that makes, navigating our project schedule pretty tricky. Of course, another pair of hands would be great, but then what if there's a dry spell and there's a month or two where we don't get any of those jobs, and then not those jobs, but those tasks that come from those clients are on pause because there's some distraction, some legal kerfuffle or something. Yeah, I mean, I wish I had a better answer as to well, I guess my answer is that I scale cautiously. And if that means I have to turn work down to kind of maintain a harmony, that's what I do. And that can be tough, but I did try to scale up at one point a lot faster, and it made me really uncomfortable, especially back to the beginning of our conversation where we talk about designing the future, and maintaining a certain kind of reputation in a space. I understood pretty quickly that I was going to be tempted to work outside of my values if I had too many mouths to feed. And so for us to maintain our niche and to maintain a certain kind of respect for the choices we've made, that means turning down work. And I think in a roundabout way, turning down work means getting work in an ironic sense for our
Yeah.
studio.
That's kind of a tough thing to do, especially if anyone who's starting an agency, let's be honest, they want to grow and they want to get it to a certain point where they're like, this is my milestone. I'm going to be comfortable once it's at this revenue. Turning down work is, you think is actually controversial to that, right? But in a way for you, you get more work from another source.
Yeah, it's a leap of faith, it's an investment in the future, but I think it's paid off. I think, it's not only paid off, I think I attract talent because people want to do a job that they feel great sleeping at night. They get to spend their time working for causes that they believe in. It doesn't feel trivial. It's, if anything, it's too taxing, and it can lead to burnout. But I think both in attracting really talented folks that are really passionate and committed, and attracting future clients that see that we're for real, that we really are committed to certain causes, I think has paid off. But certainly was not an easy choice, and is never an easy choice, but was harder to make in the beginning. You talked about how most people's models being taking what they can get. The problem with that is you may end up stuck in a category that you don't like. If you start working for cloud computing services and you hate it, you're probably gonna have to really white knuckle your way out of that category, or shift the way you position and present yourself. And comes with its own challenges, and is tricky, because ultimately the first thing people ask you, even though as a designer, if you've designed a billboard for one thing, you should be able to design a billboard for another thing. Theoretically, that doesn't tend to be how clients see it. They come to you and they say, "What have you done like this before?" And that's how they vet your experience and expertise.
I'm very excited to ask you this next question I got. It's about AI. So obviously, we're also sort of treading carefully, I guess, in this aspect. But is there any AI tools or that's made your life easier as an agency owner or for your team? Anything that you can use?
Yeah, what a great question. I mean, there are two sides to that question. I think, and one is the AI that you see and that you have a choice to engage with, and then the AI that's being built into our tools every day. Oftentimes, there's a little sparkly button you can click if you want to engage the AI in some of those tools, but some of those tools are just building it right in, and you're not going to know when you're using AI or not before too long. If you do your research, Photoshop's using, and for its generative fill. It's partnered with Google, and Nano Banana is now integrated into Photoshop more broadly. So that's one side of it. I think everybody out here is using AI, like it or not. Now, the AI that we choose to use is tricky because of this space that we work in. We work with a lot of environmentally focused organizations, and everyone knows there's a lot of consideration and talk about the environmental impact of AI, but there's also the labor concerns. There's also monopolistic, antitrust big tech concerns. And so, what does it mean to be engaging in these things that we know have a sort of moral baggage, let's say, that run counter to values? And then the other side of it is, what does it mean if we tell our clients to steer clear of one of the most powerful tools to be invented, since the internet, frankly, but and then some, is as far as I see it. I'm certainly not a techno optimist. I think I spent some time in the mid aughts, thinking about the singularity, and being fascinated by what technology could do for building global communities, reading Marshall McLuhan, and kind of, keeping an eye on it. And I was always a little skeptical, but I think there was a time where it did feel like the internet was bringing people together. And then now I think we've all seen the downstream effects, the externalities of these big things that are imposed on us at scale, or introduced to us at scale, and without considerations about our psychology, et cetera. So there are all these conflicts, but at the same time, these tools are so powerful that I fear the organizations we serve are going to be completely left in the dust if they don't figure out how to integrate AI. So I'm looking at it from that perspective. And so that means I need to consider the tools, I need to research, I need to keep learning about what's possible, and I need to engage in those tools and continue to consider those tools as an option moving forward. Now, we're not fully integrating. We've been asked to help develop chatbots for people, but that's like if someone's working in a city, someone's working for New York City, and they say, "Help us build an AI chatbot for constituent services." Our answer was, we don't think you should do that. Like, let's build a really high functioning knowledge base, FAQ, to interact with, because of the liability. And right now, AI is not to the point where and it may always make mistakes, but right now, the failure rate for any kind of hallucination or accidental misappropriation of information when you're dealing with something like constituent services can be extremely harmful and lead to lawsuits. Similar to the way that lawyers are using AI in a controlled way, that they're not engaging in the same broad databases or shouldn't be, that they're building their own AI systems within, to engage with the law on record, but not take information from unvetted sources outside of that model, maybe picking things up from Reddit. Like, that's where those hallucinations can come from. And so you want to avoid a broadly trained model in something like constituent services, I think, for the time being, just for basic legal purposes, and then obviously the implications of giving people the wrong advice or information that may be about their rights in relation to like the heat the landlord needs to is legally required to provide. That being said, I have begun to integrate tools personally, and some of my employees have as well. Others are a little more hesitant. I use a lot of Nano Banana in image editing, and I do use ChatGPT, but I'm growing a little tired of it. It seems like more and more constraints continue to be placed on it, and it begins to, I don't know, I just don't have the same success rate when it comes to images. I think it does well as a writing companion in searching for, yes, you can always use a thesaurus, and I try to do that if it's that simple. But sometimes you're looking for a phrase. Google isn't nearly as good as a large language model at helping you find the right phrase or a word that comes from a phrase, going in those directions, for example. It's also a really good proofreader. It can help you make things more succinct. I never pass off AI generated copy to a client. I only use it to bounce ideas off of. If it helps me make a thing more succinct, I will rewrite it so that it's in the appropriate voice, because it will inevitably make some word choices that, they're other people's language. It's mixing and matching. And so when you're really creating a verbal identity for a client, for example, you need to follow those standards that are created in the writing that you're providing. So I know AI products wholly, but I have begun to use them to make leaps in the sketching phase and the ideation phase. Sometimes I will show comps to a client. I will be clear that this is not the final product, but let's say we want to show them something that's done in an etching technique, and that technique's going to take us hours, but they're deciding between an etching technique and a flat vector illustration style. To have gone and done that etching technique to show them an example can be a huge waste of hours. So if you have AI do it kind of poorly, and you show them this is kind of what we're thinking, and they go, oh no, we want the flat graphic style. You go, oh my God, we just saved 5 hours, and that is the use generally that I've gotten out of it. Some video use here and there, like little things for moving backgrounds, really trying to keep an eye on, do I have time? Do I have the runway to hire an illustrator, hire a motion graphics designer, hire somebody that's appropriate for this job, trying not to edge people out of jobs.
I think to be fair, like, especially around your sort of niche, there are workflows. There isn't just like a language module, which a lot of people think, oh, that's all AI is. There are workflows you can implement internally into your agency that are actually going to make you more efficient. You're going to save, I don't know, something like 10 hours a week, depending on which process you sort of
Yeah.
automate without removing that human touch, right? Just because you
Yeah.
make sure it's working properly. Scott, thank you so much for sharing your experience.
Yes.
This has been an insightful conversation. I particularly liked your advice about if you're explaining to somebody what you do, you pretend like they're your friend's mum, which I think is something I also need to think about, because you sort of take it as a more friendlier approach rather than pitching somebody, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And you should have both, I think. You should have your pitch down too. Someone may want to know like the quick and dirty of what can you do for me?
Yeah. It
You've got
depends
10
on the
seconds to
person,
tell
like
me.
you say.
Yeah.
If people wanted to connect with you or find out more about your services, or if there's potentially something you can do for them, where can they find you?
Yeah, we're tandem.nyc. We've got an NYC URL, and same goes for socials, tandem.nyc on Instagram if they want to find us. And there's a contact form on there if you do want to talk to us. But I really love to connect with people, hear people's ideas, collaborate, and even love to just have a conversation with someone to bounce ideas around. I try to make myself as available as possible. Like you said, I can save 10 hours a week if I could be having conversations with people because I'm saving some time with internal workflows, I would love to. So and I give that advice to all agency owners. Make yourself a little more available. It can be feel like you're wasting time because you have so much to do. You've got a growing list of to-dos. But so many good things come from a conversation that doesn't necessarily have a payoff on the other side of it. There's no instant gratification. I can't tell you how many of my jobs have come from being willing to talk to somebody, and 2 years later, a year and a half, a year later, something comes of it. And it's never the plan. It's just good to share information, knowledge, advice, build community among other agency owners. That's part of these kinds of conversations, which I am really grateful to you for conducting and really appreciate you having me on.
I'm so glad you're so open-minded. It's a potential collaboration, networking, somebody you could help them in like a few years, few months time as well. So thank you for sharing that. If you enjoyed this episode, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment with what topic you would like us to break down next.